All right, and we are live. Thank you everyone for joining us. This is our discussion on the June 4th Advisory Committee meeting regarding Lykos's MDMA trial. My name is Dustin Robinson. I will be moderating this discussion. Just by way of background, I'm the founder of Eater Investments, a venture capital fund that invests in mental and behavioral health therapies, including psychedelic medicines. Also the founder of Lumalex, which is a law firm that represents a lot of law firms. And I'm also the founder of Nucleus, which is actually the owner of the platform psychedelicinvest.com, which is the platform we're using for this meeting right now. My goal in today's discussion is to provide an overview of the advisory committee meeting and also offer some insights as to the implications of the meeting. While us as the panelists, we're all very passionate about the psychedelic industry, I think it's important we all are going to try to remain as objective as possible in our discussions today. And we also want to be able to answer some of your questions. So if you have any questions whatsoever, you could drop it in the comment box and we will try to get to it at the end. There's a lot to discuss. I'm going to try to keep it to an hour. So I'm not sure we're going to get to everyone's questions, but we will do our best. So just to kick it off, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves. Edgar, if you want to go first.
Sure. Thank you, Dustin. I'm Edgar Asabe. I'm the managing partner of Keller Asabe Life Science Law, a FDA regulatory cannabis and psychedelics law firm. I've been practicing for 26 years, primarily before federal agencies, primarily FDA, USDA, CBP, EPA. I started my career at the National Cancer Institute. I was a patent and licensing advisor at NCI and worked primarily with the natural products branch, meaning plants, microbes, fungi that were being developed into therapeutics. I was also ran a natural products drug discovery company many years ago. I was the founder and CEO of Andes Pharmaceuticals. And I'm also a venture partner at Eater Investments, as Dustin mentioned, the venture fund that he founded, where I was responsible for regulatory due diligence of these psychedelic companies that we invested in.
Thank you. Lauren, you want to go next?
Sure. My name is Lauren Taus. I'm the founder of Embodied Life. It's a group psychotherapy practice based in Los Angeles and an educational platform. I train other clinicians and physicians around how to work specifically with ketamine. I am trained by MAPS and I am trained by the Ketamine Training Center, and I've trained and learned, keep learning. We are learning here today. I'm really excited about this conversation, have mixed feelings about it, of course, and I'm grateful to be here with all of you as well. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. License lives in both New York and California. I've been doing this work for about 15 years, and I'm hopeful about what's available for us in the future.
Thank you so much. And then we also have our special guest who's joining us, who kind of agreed to join us last minute. But Dave, you want to give a quick intro?
Sure. Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm Dr. Dave Rabin. I am a board-certified psychiatrist and neuroscientist. I've been studying psychedelic medicines and chronic stress for the better part of 20 years. I'm also, like Lauren, trained in ketamine-assisted therapy as well as MDMA-assisted therapy. And I am the executive director of the Board of Medicine nonprofit medical board and the chief medical officer and co-founder of Apollo Neuroscience.
Thank you so much. So there's a lot to discuss. The meeting was pretty much all day yesterday, so we're not going to cover everything. But we do want to get into their discussion points. But I actually want to start with what the vote was, because some of you may not have actually watched or maybe don't know what the outcome was. So I want to really start with what the ultimate conclusion of the meeting was. So the panel actually voted 10-1 that the benefits of MDMA therapy do not outweigh the risks, and 9-2 that the available data was insufficient to show MDMA therapy was effective in treating PTSD. So it wasn't like this was like a close call, like 6-4. I think it's very important that we recognize that this was 10-1 and 9-2 vote against MDMA therapy. So really, we did not win the hearts of the panel whatsoever. So before we get into the discussion of what really led up to that vote, I'd love for Edgar, if you could just start us off, like, what is the meaning of this vote? I know there's been a lot of talk about, people are acting like this is the end, and certainly it's a setback. But is this binding on the FDA? What happens next? What should we expect? How meaningful is this vote from the panel?
Sure. I think that's a really important point, because we have to put this in the proper context, right? So whenever there's a new drug application or one in process at the FDA conforms an advisory committee. And this was the Psychopharmacology Drugs Advisory Committee, specifically to look at this drug at the application. And in this instance, the committee, just to sort of dissuade the impression that this is FDA speaking. It's not. There was one FDA official on this committee, and it was primarily doctors, MDs, clinicians, PhDs, some MD PhDs in the area of psychiatry, in the area of clinical trial design, statistics. So this was outside professionals from the field opining as to the quality of the data that had been submitted, the thousands of pages that had been submitted in the application. And like I said, 6 university professors, 1 FDA official, 1 industry official from Janssen, 1 consumer advocate, and 1 holistic medical doctor. What does this mean? This means that this is a recommendation that is not binding on the FDA, but carries a lot of weight. The majority of the time, FDA does 2 things with these, with the comments of the committee. Remember, there was, I think, 6 questions, and only 2 of them were voted on. FDA gathers information from these hearings and also from the written reports that the committee will produce, and then helps FDA evaluate from a regulatory perspective whether Lykos has met the burdens to show that this is safe and efficacious. And the specific questions that you mentioned, Dustin, obviously are those votes are not binding on the FDA, but they carry a lot of weight. And in my opinion, just like you said, the votes were 9-2 and 10-1. There was compelling reasons why the burdens were not met on both those questions. And I believe that FDA would find it very hard to approve this current application.
Dustin, you're muted.
You very much. Yeah, well, no, that's perfect. Just leading in, I want to now talk about those reasons that they have for their votes, and I want to talk about some of the main issues that were discussed during the panel. And one of those main issues was functional unblinding, and this is really something that is going to be an issue for pretty much all the psychedelic trials that we're having. Although the participants were randomized to either drug or placebo, the vast majority, approximately 90% of those assigned to drug and 75% of those assigned to placebo, were able to accurately guess the treatment assignment. So Lauren and Dave, I know you guys have thought a lot about this, and you guys are in practice. I'd like to have a discussion about what is functional unblinding. What are some of the challenges we have in the psychedelic industry around functional unblinding, and whether there were any kind of lessons learned from this meeting about maybe what we can do as an industry to address functional unblinding.
Lauren, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, these medicines have an impact on our bodies and on our systems in a way that's quite obvious. And so functional unblinding makes it that you took the pill or you didn't take the pill. It's not, there's no placebo option in functional unblinding. And when someone has taken a medicine that has psychoactive properties, they're likely to know. They're likely to feel different, quite literally. And it's within that space that kind of more radical healing can happen, I believe. But for study purposes, to blind it gives us more robust data. And simultaneously, it's difficult when we're working with these kinds of medicines because the person is likely to know that they're feeling something that is out of the ordinary.
Yeah, and I think, and thank you, Lauren. And I think just to add to that, we need to be taking this in the context of the clinical trials ecosystem as a whole, which is that placebo really refers to the belief effect that a medicine will or will not work for you. So placebo is really a way that we think about how much belief in a treatment working or not working for you impacts the overall outcome. And that has to be taken into context with what the overall outcome is. Belief and placebo effect are a component of every single medical treatment that is ever administered, whether it's a physical health treatment or a mental health treatment. And if you look at all pharmaceutical trials of any double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial of any mental health medication, there is always a component of functional unblinding as a piece of that trial, where subjects do have the ability to guess with a certain percentage of accuracy whether or not they were given the active drug or the placebo. And in this case, with these MAPS trials, MAPS actually did a tremendous job of placebo controlling, because the way that they did it was they administered doses of MDMA that were beneath the dose threshold for MDMA to be active. And so everybody actually received MDMA, which is really interesting. The difference is that people in the blinded group, in the placebo group, received MDMA that was at a dose that was below dose threshold. And so they didn't actually achieve the full medicinal impact of MDMA. They received some of the effects of MDMA that did not reach the level of what we call therapeutic benefit, where MDMA is fully active. And for an average individual, that's something like over 70 or 80 milligrams, depending on your height, weight, size, et cetera. And so if you compare that to most other trials that are done with pharmaceuticals in the mental health space, they are actually suffering the same issues with functional unblinding, which is why I was so surprised to see that as their concern, because most mental health trials, people are able to guess whether or not there was active drug or not, because the placebo is often a sugar pill, or it's something that has no effect on the patient and the consciousness of the patient or their mood, anxiety, et cetera, whereas the drug does. So whether you're looking at a benzodiazepine like Ativan, Xanax, Valium, or Ambien, or an antidepressant medication, a lot of the time, the subject can guess whether or not they've been given an active drug or not. Does that make the results invalid? Of course not, because all these drugs have been approved. And so I think, it's important to consider functional unblinding in the placebo-controlled environment as a component of what contributes to outcome. But if you look at the effect of placebo in the placebo literature, in mental health, it's something like 30 to 40% of the effect at most can be attributed to people believing that the placebo or the drug will work for them. And what we're seeing in the MDMA trials with MAPS is that there is an 88% response rate to MDMA therapy, whereas there's a less than 50% response rate to standard of care with Paxil and Zoloft. So that's much, much more response than just could be accounted for by 30 to 40% of the belief effect. So and the folks in the placebo group, many of them relapse and end up having PTSD symptoms again. And the folks in the active group don't, and they sustain benefit in the phase 2 trials up to a year out. We see that people actually continue to get better in the group that received active MDMA. So that is a much, much greater effect percentage-wise than can be accounted for by placebo alone. So the functional unblinding argument in this case, to me as a clinical researcher and a clinician who's worked with patients in this environment, doesn't really hold weight. And to see so many people in this committee focusing on that really decreases my confidence in their ability to thoroughly evaluate the impact of placebo-controlled trials in the setting.
Yeah, and during the meeting, they actually talked a little bit about how, functional unblinding doesn't mean it's per se not a good trial and we can't trust the outcome, right? It's kind of a factor in the outcome. But one thing they did talk a lot about is that that 40% of the participants in the MDMA group previously took MDMA. So there was some maybe expectancy bias there. I know MAPS kind of rebutted that, showing that from an efficacy perspective, the people who had taken MDMA before didn't perform any better than the people that didn't. So I think that was really good that they had that data. But later in the meeting, the committee mentioned that this could also affect the safety aspect of it as well if you've already taken it. So we'll love maybe whoever wants to jump in. Edgar, you haven't talked about the functional blinding yet. Is there any? What are your thoughts around the functional blinding, and what do you think of the 40%?
Well, I agree with Dave's assessment that this is common, especially with psychedelics. But I think there's other issues that the committee found that were somewhat aggravating to this reality, and that is also the the unblinding of the actual therapists. And there was allegations, or could be anecdotal, but there were allegations that there was some pressure to report or not report adverse effects, things of that sort. And that came up, and that was before the committee. And so when you have functional unblinding, it's one thing. When you have functional unblinding plus that aggravating factor, I think that's the thing that the committee really was sensitive to. But like Dave mentioned, you're never going to get rid of this. It's just that the other, I think, data gaps, and again, Lykos can rebut with good data saying, even though we selected patients that had already 40% had already had experience with MDMA. It's just not good clinical trial design. That is always going to lose you points with FDA. And again, FDA is trying to impose, or that the regimen is something that they're familiar with that works. This is something that is expanded beyond that with the therapy component. And I think that's what conflates some of these issues, makes them a little bit more of a concern for FDA than if it were just the functional unblinding.
Do you mind if I add something to that, Edgar?
Please.
So I was just going to add that one of the things that is really contradictory here, but you're exactly right, that's contradictory in the pharmaceutical world, is that many of the pharmaceutical trials in mental health populations are actually being submitted to the FDA in completely drug-naive populations. And many of those populations are in third world countries and people who have never touched pharmaceuticals from a mainstream pharmaceutical company. So if we're talking about representative data, right? Yeah. How many people do you know in America who have never taken a prescription drug, right? Almost no one, if not no one. And so when you think about the data that was presented and the fact that the results for the 40% that had prior experience with MDMA were no better, as Dustin mentioned, or not significantly better than the folks who had experience with MDMA or who had never experienced MDMA, then yes, it is a particular flaw of the trial, and it's important to point out. At the same time, I think MAPS actually did a surprisingly good job of mitigating that by showing the comparative results. At the same time, we're looking at, in the context of pharmaceutical trials, that a lot of the drugs that do ultimately get approval based on drug-naive populations, which is not representative of you and I or any veteran with PTSD or anybody else who is in the mental health community, because many of those people have tried 1, 2, or more drugs and failed already. So, it's a little bit hypocritical to say on their part that this is a significant flaw that requires this much attention when many of the drugs that come from mainstream pharma have many similar or other flaws that aren't really publicly addressed in the same way.
Absolutely. And I think that this is also going to be a learning experience for FDA, because FDA has to adapt in order to be able to regulate psychedelics the way that they're coming today. And I heard a lot of that on the panel discussion, and it's been seen by FDA, breakthrough therapy status, etc. They are wanting to play ball, but they're going from a very rigid system that is used to single molecules, and they know exactly, what in certain areas it's very cut and dry, and it just can't be that way, particularly when you have the therapy component that adds all new challenges that I'm sure we're going to talk about some more.
Yeah, and you know, I'm in on a bunch of WhatsApp chats with different people opining about the meeting, and you know, there seems to be several people talking about like how could maps have let in people, you know, 40% of the people. But you know, thinking about how this happened, like I don't think maps like actively tried to recruit people who have previously taken it, but it makes sense logically. The people who are going to be open and willing to sign up for an MDMA trial maybe people that have already tried it and are comfortable with it, right? And just so like, you know, part of my goal here with this discussion is also to have some takeaways for other, you know, psychedelic companies that are doing trials or for Lykos or whatever. You know, it seems obviously Lykos has all these exclusionary factors, right? And it's very hard to recruit for these trials, right? So it's probably pretty damn hard to say no to someone just because they've tried the drug before. There's a lot of people who have tried the drug before, right? Um, what are your guys' thoughts? Do you think future clinical trials, this should be like an exclusionary factor, or do you just need to measure it and only let in a certain amount of people? Like, how do you manage this if you're Compass Pathway or any of these other number of psychedelic drug development companies?
I mean, it's a tricky problem. Lauren, feel free to jump in. I don't know if you were about to.
It is a tricky problem. I mean, I think that the whole process is very difficult to measure. A lot of the elements that are we're looking for data behind, and just because somebody has had an experience with the medicine doesn't like preclude them as a candidate if they have a deep trauma history, if they're appropriate for this type of intervention, if this kind of work. And it becomes problematic exclusionary criteria and criteria that like is done just for the sake of doing it. I understand that optimally someone wants a quote unquote clean slate, but that doesn't really exist. So I don't know. What do you think, Dave?
I mean, there's so the obvious challenges you stated are true, right? And you know, I think if you look at the statistics of people surveyed in the community, the statistics I have from a few years ago showed, actually, this was maybe 2019. It was something like there's over 1 million new recreational users of MDMA every single year in the U.S. alone, right? So these are often people who are not just going to parties and taking MDMA. They're people who are in deep pain, who have taken lots of other measures to try to treat their mental health problems and not had success. And then somebody says, hey, what about trying MDMA? And it's usually an underground practitioner, right? And I think that when you're recruiting for a trial that's as complex as the MAPS Lykos trials, and recruitment is a critical factor, you know, when we run clinical trials, getting subjects recruited is extremely challenging when you're running on a budget. And, you know, MAPS and Lykos don't have $1 billion to spend on the development of this work. So it's all donation based for the most part. And so, you know, what they've done is really laudable in terms of figuring out how to navigate these challenges. But I think that, you know, the main thing that they did that I think really speaks to the tenacity and the thoughtfulness that the MAPS and Lykos team brought into this is that they interviewed subjects afterwards and they asked them, you know, what did you think of this? And one of the most common responses by subjects who experienced MDMA within the trial setting was, and then I had also experienced it before in this 40% group we're talking about, is I don't believe that you gave me the same drug, right? I don't believe you gave me the same drug. Why? Because the medicine amplifies the safety of the therapeutic container. And the therapeutic container is that space that is created, that safe, non-judgmental space that's created by people like Lauren and I who practice this work, who create this environment for people to have these you know, profoundly safe, meaning-making experiences where they can reshape the meaning around past traumatic events that have changed and distorted the way they see themselves into victims of circumstance. And what MDMA really seems to be doing is, in the right environment, which the environment is critical, and that's what I think these testimonies really show, is that you can take MDMA recreationally outside of a therapeutic container and you won't get or won't necessarily get the same kinds of benefits that you're going to get when you take it in the therapeutic container. So I think what MAPS did and Lykos did is actually really interesting from a clinical trials perspective, because in publicly disclosing that 40% of the participants had prior experience with MDMA, and that most of those people didn't believe they took the same drug in the therapeutic context of the trial, and that the results were dramatically different in the clinical trial setting compared to recreational use or underground use, it shows the power of the combined approach of the MDMA assisted therapy. It's not just take this pill and go home and figure it out on your own, like with SSRIs or with antipsychotics. It's we combine the medicine with this very highly structured therapy program, and it's the medicine that amplifies the therapeutic experience for people to have these profound outcomes that result in effectively a reversal of the findings that we see with SSRIs for PTSD. Like 88% response rates with MDMA assisted therapy, again in the phase 3, that's less than 50% for people with SSRIs like Paxil and Zoloft. Many of those people who take Paxil and Zoloft have taken Paxil and Zoloft before, right? So I think that, seeing these differences and seeing that even though people have had MDMA experiences in the past, and despite that, they are still obtaining substantial benefits, but not necessarily more than everybody else who is naive, but substantial benefits with the therapeutic protocol added on, to me, as a researcher and a clinician, is actually more of a strength than a weakness. And typically, I know how the FDA looks at this stuff, and they will criticize that, but it's really, really interesting from a research perspective, and I think it actually bolsters the results rather than hurts them.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are kind of doing this 2020 hindsight, like, oh, how could they not have thought of this? And then when you really dig into it and you realize how hard it is to recruit, and is this really that big of an issue? And quite frankly, I think if they would have, excluded some people that have taken MDMA, but maybe there was a lot of people who took psilocybin or 5-MeO or some other psychedelic, like, then the panel would have been focusing on that. Hey, these other people, even though they haven't taken MDMA, 40% of the people have taken a psychotropic substance before, and that skews the results. So I think it's really hard to address every single part of it. And even in the discussion around some of the interim use by participants, they talked about use of ketamine and 5-MeO. So it wasn't limited to, did any of these participants use MDMA? It was, hey, some of these participants, after their MDMA therapy, they also did these other psychedelic substances that could skew the results. So I think it's not just on the screening for MDMA. I think some of these psychedelic drug development companies, if they really think this is an issue, it would be screening for all psychotropic substances. But I want to move on from this topic, because I think we could have a whole panel on functional unblinding and we could talk for hours on this. But I want to talk about some of the other issues. And one of the other big issues that they discussed was that there was not an arm of the trial that used MDMA without therapy. So some of the presenters questioned whether we could determine whether the therapy is actually needed. They also discussed the lack of standardization in the therapy protocol. And I know before the call, Lauren was talking about, her and I were talking about how it's almost impossible to kind of standardize a therapy protocol. It would have been great for them to have an arm of just MDMA. They did do an arm with, the placebo with therapy. They did an arm with MDMA with therapy. I guess the obvious next arm would be MDMA, no therapy. I can only assume they didn't do that because, just like Dave mentioned, they have financial and resource restraints. They were functionally operating as a nonprofit for a very long time. And even as a for-profit, you're not trying to waste money as well. So I assume they didn't do that additional arm for those reasons. But I think it would be helpful just to open up the discussion. I guess just starting with Dave and Lauren, you guys are practitioners. How important from your perspective is the therapy aspect of psychedelic medicine?
Yeah, I think we really are suffering in this culture from chronic loneliness. And chronic loneliness is more adverse for our overall health than chronic smoking and chronic drinking. And the relationship that comes online in good therapy is one of the most important aspects of treatment. And it's a human exercise. Like, this isn't something that you can predict. when I'm working with clients, I'm always going to invite them to take time to decide if they want to work with me, right? And I'm also simultaneously going to decide if I feel like I'm the right fit. And the relationship is in my mind the most essential ingredient, right? To divorce the relationship from this, just then we're really in a drug conversation. Like for me, the medicine, this MDMA in this case, is partnered within the context of good relationship, so that a person has an internal atmosphere of safety, right? If they're not feeling safe, that could also be amplified by the medicine, right? The medicine in many ways is innocent and neutral. And I'm thinking back to the studies in the 50s and 60s with LSD, where clients were often dosed even against their consent in hospitals. Like, what does it look like to give someone a medicine just for the sake of giving them that medicine? And is that in good ethics? MDMA is often pretty gentle, but I think the point is, like, how is this working in the context of a relationship? I understand the merit of it from a scientific perspective, but a lot of these things, as I mentioned, are just difficult to standardize. And I know that one of the challenges in the conversation yesterday was the lack of standardized process within the therapeutic container and the therapeutic relationship. And therapy is not standardized. Like, people are people, and what unfolds in the process of a healing journey is going to be unique to each person. And I think good care involves an integrative approach of what's being asked for by the individual system. And a lot of studies don't really make space for that kind of conversation and that kind of exploration. I know there was quite a lot of protest against the inner-directed work, and this is just not clear, and what are we doing? And we're learning, and we're in a discovery process. And a lot of mainstream therapy has positioned the providers as the ones with the answers, and that kind of hierarchical engagement hasn't really done very well by people, and in fact has created more and more problems for the ones that are seeking help. So to shift the conversation into one where we're actually looking to activate the wisdom and healing capacity within the participant is far more interesting to me, and I think useful to rely on their respective skills and trainings, right? Could there be more space? And we were also in the time before we jumped on live, Edgar was saying what a rich learning this is, and there's a lot for us to kind of move forward from here, and we will, because we have a big movement of people who understand more intimately and understand beyond the stats and facts, right? Like, this is a spiritual human mystery process as well as it is a drug and FDA conversation. But what can we learn? How can we perhaps create more measures that are somewhat able to, that we can somewhat standardize, so that we can get more robust information? But ultimately, this is a human relationship conversation as well as a drug one, and that is, I'm going to say, impossible to fully measure.
Yeah, I think you really nailed that, Lauren. And I think for those of you who are listening who don't have context into how psychotherapy is done or how psychotherapy trials are done, psychotherapy, as Lauren said, is a personal relationship. If you're delivering psychotherapy without personalizing it at all to the person who's receiving it, you're going to do a bad job most of the time, because it's about the personal relationship and about the foundation of trust that you build with your therapist, right? So that being said, if you're going to fault MAPS, if we're going to fault MAPS and Lykos for having too much deviation in the psychotherapy approach, for one, that is actually not well-founded, and I'll explain why in a minute. And number two, you have to fault every single psychotherapy trial that's ever been conducted, because they are all based on creating a personal relationship and tailoring this therapy, whether it's psychodynamic or CBT or DBT or any other kind of psychotherapy, to the individual who's being served. So that's number one. Number two is MAPS and Lykos actually did an incredible job. We've been spending a lot of time talking about the FDA comments about all the bad things they did, but they did an incredible job of navigating this between the phase 2 trial results, which were accomplished, which were already landmark trial results showing from the phase 2 trials that something like 55% of people with PTSD for an average of 17.6 years, treatment resistant, never gotten better with any treatment, 2 months out, are over 50% are no longer meeting diagnostic criteria for PTSD. And 1 year out, that number without additional treatment provided by MAPS went up to 67%. So again, medicine stopped, therapy stopped, people continue to get better. Now let's look what happens in the placebo group. Some of them still get better too. It was like 30%, maybe 35% in the phase 2 trial actually experienced good positive results around remission after the end of the phase 2 trial. However, you follow those people a year out, half of them roughly relapsed into PTSD. So there's clearly a benefit of the therapy. The therapy works. We know therapy works. We've known it for a long time. When you add the medicine, MDMA is actually amplifying the benefits of the therapeutic container. It's like a therapy amplifier. So that is what is actually contributing not to just the boost in short-term benefits after the treatment is stopped, but also to the sustaining of those benefits and even increasing of those benefits at 1 year out, which, to put it in perspective, has never been seen before in the history of psychiatry. We have never in the history of our field seen any treatment continue to work and more people to be in remission 1 year out than they were when the treatment stopped. So that is really important to note. And what's also important to note is in that phase 2 trial, all of those people who provided that therapy were highly trained, seasoned providers from MAPS at the time. In the new trial, the phase 3 trial that we're all talking about today, predominantly, what's really interesting that MAPS and Lykos did is they had all of those seasoned trained providers train new providers to provide the care in the new study. And in the new study, the whole goal was, can we disseminate and scale this treatment by training formerly untrained people to now deliver this care and still get similar results? And what's even more interesting is the results from the initial findings in the phase 3 trial from newly trained providers were actually better than the results from the phase 2 trial. The response rates went up. The outcomes rates got better. So they were actually able to show that the therapy plus MDMA, even in newly trained people, is extremely effective despite all of the challenges that they faced in the trial context. And I think, to go back to answering your question, Dustin, your core question is, what about drug alone? I think that question answers itself based on what I said before, which is that there are over 1 million new MDMA users every single year in the general American population. Why haven't we seen PTSD eradicated already? Why haven't we seen depression eradicated already? If the drug works so well on its own, why wouldn't everybody get so much better just by taking the drug and going to a party or hanging out with their friends? Because that's not how this drug works. The drug is a therapy amplifier. So I think what MAPS has done and Lykos has done in this context is actually showing, hey, drug alone, we know that doesn't actually accomplish these benefits. We know the drug accomplishes these great benefits when given with seasoned providers who may not be able to disseminate that. And then we showed we can disseminate it at scale by training new people and get even better outcomes. So I think, to answer your question, the drug alone group isn't that interesting. It doesn't really shed that much new light, and it is an unnecessary cost that is unreasonable to expect MAPS and Lykos to fund in this case, because we know that MDMA doesn't have these effects on its own.
Yeah, so just staying on this topic with the therapy, Edgar, I want to ask you a question kind of more with a regulatory lens. You know, it was several years ago where you actually, Edgar, taught me how challenging it is with combination drugs to get them approved. Because if you have a drug with compound A, B, and C, you need to run trials on A, you got to run trials on B, C, got to run trials on A and B together, B and C together, A and C together, and then all of them together. You got to go every variation. And in their discussion, it kind of seemed like that's what they were getting at, is this is like a combination drug where you need to do each of them alone. So can you just kind of talk about like from a regulatory perspective, like what are the challenges and like, is there anything that you could kind of compare this to in like the standard,
Sure.
pharma space?
Yeah. First of all, I want to say that Lauren and Dave's, comments are, that's boots on the ground. That's, in the room with the patients. And I have tremendous respect for that. And I think the perspective that I bring, and I say that as a preface because this perspective that I bring is how do we get this approved by FDA, right? Because I agree with everything that Dave and Lauren, they're experts in their field and they know what works and what doesn't. And that's really the ultimate goal. But here in the United States, unless we get it through FDA and approved, there's going to be always the illicit market with variable success, et cetera, and variable safety issues. So what we have here, Dustin, you've hit right on it. This is actually way more challenging than a two molecule compound that's being submitted for approval. In the words of one of the reviewers yesterday, one of the committee members, they said, this is an experimental drug and an experimental therapy. And it goes beyond that. FDA doesn't approve or evaluate therapies. They're out of their, they admitted it. We don't do that. It's not their jurisdiction. They don't have the regulatory authority because this is not something that they do, right? And so they, in some ways, they seemed naive because they had not evaluated certain things. There was one of the committee members said, couldn't you just in this instance also regulate the therapy? And it's like, I wish it were that easy, but there's something that's going to happen. We have a structural problem here, right? David and Lauren have just explained how the MDMA and the right therapy done correctly is tremendously efficacious versus, as Dave discussed, just the MDMA. It's not helping people with PTSD. People are going to raves. That's what they're doing. And that's very different. The point is that FDA is not equipped to evaluate, doesn't have the authority, regulatory authority to evaluate the therapy. So all the good things that are being said about how therapy supports this is lost on FDA, right? We had statisticians, we have pharmacokinetics people, we had clinicians, et cetera, but not, people who are there to evaluate the therapy component. So if you were to follow what FDA usually requires, you would have each one separate, evaluated in a clinical trial arm, and then together, right, for two of them. They don't have the ability to evaluate the therapy. And that's a structural problem that's going to have to be resolved, because until that happens, not only will FDA not see all the good components and the tremendous work that MAPS and Lykos have done on the therapy side, they won't have the ability to appreciate that or evaluate it. Certain things, though, that were commented on regarding therapy, I think are worth noting. Number one, FDA has no confidence in the therapy, and again, especially in the context of the ethical abuses that took place in what was supposedly an ideal situation under clinical trials. What happens if you put this out to 10,000, 100,000, 500,000 points of distribution of this drug therapy solution? What's going to happen there? I think that's a legitimate concern. Number two, the standardization of these therapies. I'm sure there's lousy approaches and there's very good approaches, right? And so standardizing these, like who is going to administer this? Are there going to be clinics that are for-profit, independently run? And what is going to be the ethics and the incentive of those clinics? In states like Florida, where I'm in, non-physicians can own healthcare businesses. And oftentimes we have ethical problems here for that very reason. So these are issues that need to be addressed by the proper body. And usually it's the state licensing boards. But there needs to be a bridge that comes together, a regulatory coordination between the FDA and the state regulatory bodies in order to be able to, number one, fully appreciate the value of the therapy that MAPS Lykos has developed, and two, to make sure that that's regulated in a way that is active, that isn't, you can't just say your drug is approved and your therapy is approved, and we can only have enforcement actions against your drug and don't have any jurisdiction over your therapy. That's a big problem, and I think that makes FDA sound naive when they talk about therapy because they're not equipped. That's not what they evaluate. But there's a solution, and I think FDA is ready to learn and maybe do something about this. And MAPS and Lykos have to also figure out how do we, because the other criticism was, well, Lykos controls the drug product, and now they've told us that they are sort of self-regulating. We have the best therapy protocols. It's like, well, it would be better to have an independent body look at that, verify that, and enforce that process. That probably is a better route. So it's the architecture that needs to, the regulatory architecture that needs to be resolved or created to fully appreciate the work that's been done by Lykos.
And Edgar, maybe you could just speak really quickly. You know, one of the things the FDA did say is that, you know, they can't regulate therapy, but they could regulate safety. So kind of putting the therapy really in the context of safety, like there needs to be 2 licensed practitioners in the room. You know, you need to have, you know, meetings afterwards with your practitioner. It's all kind of in the context of safety, not really efficacy. So could you talk like a little bit about like that fine line of safety versus efficacy?
Well, this is the same, it's a continuation of my previous comments, right? When FDA can regulate safety, it's the safety of the therapeutic, right? Now they looked and the committee members opined that, you know, why is it that you have one license and one can be unlicensed? They also brought up the issue of, you know, are you really, if there's an ethical issue, is really somebody who's in training going to call out, you know, their mentor who might be the licensed person? All those issues, FDA is not equipped to evaluate. That the committee members can opine. There are a lot of psychiatrists on that committee, and therefore they're familiar with these issues. They were flagging those issues, but certainly FDA can't put on their label for usage, you know, take once a day after a meal and be sure that there are 2 licensed therapists. That's not the way it works. They can't do that. We need a licensing body that looks at that safety. So it's the same issue as before. The safety on the therapy has to be the purview of the proper regulatory agency, and there has to be coordination with FDA. And then the questions are, who administers this? Who is qualified? What is the licensing? You know, is Lykos now a for-profit pharmaceutical company going to be the one that is taking care of the best interests of these vulnerable people who've gone through trauma, who become more vulnerable during therapy? I don't think that's a satisfactory answer. And those are the questions that have come up that I think need work if we're going to, you know, if Lykos and the industry is going to continue moving towards approved therapies with approved therapeutics along with therapy.
And so I want to, just because of time, I want to move on from efficacy and talk a little bit about safety. But before I do, I wanted to kind of give the whole panel an opportunity. Any kind of final comments on any of the stuff we discussed or anything related to efficacy you think is important that you wanted to mention? Any of you? All right, so we are going to move on to safety discussion. We talked a lot about the efficacy stuff. So on the safety side, from my perspective, I'd be interested to get the panel's perspective. I thought that they were a lot softer on the safety side. You know, they talked about the cardiovascular risk. They also talked about how Lykos, for whatever reason, didn't get them the information they requested on likelihood of abuse. I don't know what was behind that. I don't see why Lykos wouldn't have. I'm sure they have some sort of explanation for that. But there was a lot of discussion on the cardiovascular side. But a lot of that stuff they did say could probably be addressed in post-marketing studies or with REMS. So I want to get into like how that works with post-marketing studies. But first, maybe Dave or Lauren, if you could just talk a little bit about some of those safety issues they brought up relating to the cardiac profile.
You want to go? So I think the major safety issues of MDMA therapy that were reported in the trials are probably not unfamiliar to most of you. They're things like muscle tightness, decreased appetite, nausea, excessive sweating, hot and cold feelings, and then short-term increases in blood pressure and heart rate. These are well known, not just for MDMA, but for every single amphetamine drug, the most common of which that you know of is called Adderall. It is so widely overprescribed in the United States that there is a shortage of this medication. And guess who gets it more than anybody else? Children, right? So when we're thinking about the kinds of side effects that we are willing to tolerate with medications like Adderall, again, just to put it into context, which is basically pharmaceutical methamphetamine, we are accepting giving this to kids because teachers and parents demand it, and we give it to them without physician supervision or therapy. MDMA has basically the same overall side effect profile for the most part, and it's given in this context that's highly controlled with two therapists watching and observing the patients very, very closely. And they didn't have, at least from my review of the clinical trials data, any significant adverse cardiovascular effects beyond what I just mentioned, which is short-term increase in blood pressure or heart rate. And so, as a practicing clinician, I would tell you that the side effects that we're really concerned about in mental health are not slightly increased and temporarily increased blood pressure and heart rate. It's suicide. And when we look at the medications we're comparing MDMA to, which is the current standard of care, Paxil and Zoloft, are FDA cleared medications that carry the most severe warning for any drug next to an outright ban, which is called a black box warning, which is that the use of these medications can increase the risk of suicidality. What could be more damaging and deleterious and risky of a side effect for a mental health patient than potentially increasing their suicidality and risk of attempts, right? So we just need to put this into context, that the slight increase, temporary increase in heart rate and blood pressure that goes away after the drug is worn off is a lot less concerning for us as practicing clinicians, especially in the mental health field, than what we're currently using today, which MDMA assisted therapy would be helping to replace, which is Paxil and Zoloft, which have black box warnings of increased suicidality. So I think overall, point taken that we need to think about the side effect profile so that we can evaluate these medications thoroughly and understand somebody who comes in with a cardiovascular history may not be the best candidate for MDMA therapy. That's great to know. We need everybody to know that. But to state that as something that gives significant concern over what we're currently using seems like a red herring to me.
Yeah.
Lauren, anything to add on top of that, or?
I think that was perfectly said. And if there's questions there's more questions, I think that would be useful to answer as well. Thank you. That was perfect.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of that does flow into, and Edgar, I'm gonna let you respond to it. I think in the answer to this, you might be able to respond to it. They did kind of say that this could be addressed in post-marketing studies. So I think kind of what they're saying seems to be somewhat consistent with what Dave's saying here. So Edgar, first, any comments on my last question, but also could you talk us through like how post-marketing studies really work and like when they're appropriate?
Sure. Well, there was a lot of discussion, and many of the committee members would end their comments saying, but this could be, addressed with post-marketing surveillance, sometimes known as phase 4. And that is when you require, when you don't have enough data on some issue, but it isn't enough to stop the approval of an NDA, and therefore you approve it, but it's like an approval with an asterisk. Now you have to collect data. You have to collect that, take an EKG afterwards, right? Collect data on, have them come in 2 weeks later, or a week later, or a month later, or maybe all of those, and gather some other type of data. That's so you can see if there's any adverse effects, like suicide tendencies, things of that sort, which would inform the regulators. And maybe later on, you might require a black box. If it's been approved without a black box, you don't have the data to impose that then you would have your first year data, your second year data, and then FDA at some point would be satisfied with what other requirements they might have or restrictions or contraindications that would be necessary. But again, remember, they're weighing risk and benefit. Every pharmaceutical that is approved by FDA has that long list of contraindications and adverse effects. And so there are plenty of risks with potent pharmaceuticals. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be taking them. You should be taking them under this context, and the benefit outweighs the risk. Yesterday, the committee voted that it didn't. They had too much doubt with regard to the quality of the data and the experimental design, the clinical trial design, and therefore will require other studies to fill what they perceive as these data gaps, which from a traditional FDA perspective, in evaluating small molecules, it appears to have plenty of data gaps. But again, I think the evaluation process has to evolve on the FDA side, and some more work has to be done by Lykos. But black boxes, REMS. The other thing, Dustin, is REMS, right? REMS basically, when we had our COVID shots, they said you have to stay there for 15 minutes. They're looking for, anaphylactic shock. They're looking for allergic reaction, something. And then with Spravato, with ketamine, nasal ketamine, you have to stay for 2 hours, again, to see if there are adverse effects. Now they're saying you're going to, if approved, MDMA would be approved with under the REMS program. REMS programs aren't traditionally programs in which, in that space of time, at that moment, you provide therapy. You're usually watching, possibly observing for adverse effects. So again, it's a stretch to fit the therapy component into the REMS program. It's not the appropriate vehicle, really.
Yeah, and they gave some really good examples. I would encourage anyone who's like a ketamine clinic. I get a lot of questions like, what should ketamine clinics be doing to prepare for MDMA? They had like 3 or 4 slides on like what they'd be expecting in the REMS for MDMA, and I think those were really good slides that should give you some insight as to how a psychedelic clinic will need to be operating under MDMA or any future psychedelic FDA-approved drugs. Any other comments on this particular topic, or should we move on to the next topic? All right. Which is the next topic I'd like to talk about? Well, okay, so I want to really quickly talk about, there's the main question kind of everyone's speculating on is what is going to be the result on August 11th, right? So, we have this vote of essentially don't approve from the panel. But I want to talk a little bit about the things we have going for us. And I want to kind of get the panel's thoughts on this. So, the things we have going for us is, number one, PTSD is a horrible indication, and there's been no FDA-approved drugs in over 25 years, right? The PTSD numbers keep getting worse and worse. Huge unmet need, right? So even if when you have these in the 80% efficacy numbers, even if there's issues with the data, if we believe it could provide some relief to these people suffering with PTSD, and the current medicines are so bad, I think we have that going for us. Number two, the fact that it was designated as a breakthrough therapy is I think important. Number three, the fact that in 2017, MAPS did a special protocol assessment process with the MDMA where they talked through the design, although the FDA was very clear that when they agree to a special protocol assessment, that doesn't bind them in the future to say the clinical trial was done correctly. And then number four, and these are just things I'm kind of thinking of, is that, it seems that the FDA, they've been working with Lykos for quite some time, way longer than this advisory panel, right? So it seems like this advisory panel was called up, and this is like their first time really, I'm sure some of them have read some literature before, but they're really kind of like, this is like a brand new thing to them, and they're like, have to opine on it. So they're like, hell no. Meanwhile, the FDA has had a lot of communications with Lykos throughout this process. Although they might not be fully equipped to deal with something like this, they're more equipped than this advisory panel. So I think hopefully the FDA, through those previous discussions, has a different perspective than the panel. Although I didn't get the feeling through listening to the media and get that sense. On the negative side, obviously, like Edgar kind of mentioned, the negative stuff that 10-1, 9-2 votes, that doesn't look good. There's some real issues that they pointed out with the data. But I think kind of everyone's asking and speculating on August 11th what's going to happen. And in that answer, I just want to kind of go around the panel and get your guys' thoughts. In that answer, specifically, Edgar, I'd love to understand, rather than just saying, I don't think they're going to approve on August 11th, is there something else they can do other than just saying, go back and do a new phase 3 trial? So I'll start with you, Edgar. You kind of gave us your answer on the first question on that you don't think the FDA is going to approve. So maybe I'll just get right to the second part of that question. Is there something that the FDA could do that they don't approve, but maybe just do this one more study? Or do you think it's going to be full on, you guys have to do a new phase 3 study?
Just to put a little bit more context, I think there's tremendous liability for FDA to approve with the data set that is currently in the NDA. And to push back a little bit on the committee, many of these members have been on many committees previously. They understand the data, and they've had access to the data. So, for example, the PhD statistician just looked at the statistics and the p-values and then anything that's conflating. And same with the clinical design people. So I wouldn't characterize it as they've just jumped in. No, they've had access and they studied it, and these are professionals who take this very seriously and have sat on previous panels. And the quality of the panel is quite impressive. And FDA relies on expert panels, and they have experts in-house also, but in a way to have a balance. They rely on outside independent panel members and experts. And so I think that the issues that were brought up by the panel members are going to be the issues that FDA focuses on, the main ones. And so to answer your question, what is FDA going to come back with? They're going to come back with suggestions for a new study, or maybe more than one study. And then they're going to address the therapy component, which they don't have their arms around and became a real issue, mostly pointed out by the psychiatrists on the panel, that needs to be regulated somehow. You can't let the pharmaceutical company be also the patient advocate for how therapy should or should not be. I think those are the two components, Dustin. I think they're going to require a full study that is designed with differently, plus recommendations as to addressing the therapy portion of Lykos application.
Dave, you want to go next?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of hope here, and I agree with a lot of what Edgar is saying in terms of the process. I think there's a huge education gap between, as Edgar was saying, the folks on this panel who weighed in on this initial vote, and, for example, the folks on the FDA who have been working with MAPS for a decade or more to actually coach them and collaborate with them on how to conduct these trials. I think many people who are new to this area don't realize that MAPS has been working very closely with the FDA for a decade or more to make sure that these trials were conducted in a way that was acceptable to the FDA. And perhaps some of that has changed in terms of who's sitting on the FDA as a decision maker. It's hard to say. But, I think based on, what they are looking for that the panel called out, will those things come up on August 11th? I'm sure they will. But I think there's a lot of hope for patients in that if we look at this as an educational gap, that the regulatory powers that be do not fully understand the devastating impact of PTSD currently, which, in large part is damaging to not just our entire society as a public health problem, but to veterans who are the major population that would be served by this. people who have literally given and made the ultimate sacrifice to our country for our freedom, and then come back and don't have the adequate support they need, and yet there has not been another drug approved by the FDA in 25 years to serve them. What message does that send to the public, right? What message does that send to people who they're trying to recruit to go serve and fight for our freedom overseas? I don't think it sends a very good message, and I think that needs to be taken into account, which is that if the FDA does not take all of the information, including the challenges with the trials, but also the overwhelmingly positive results of the trials into account, and really look at this from an objective perspective, that they're going to be slapping our veteran communities in the face by not saying, hey, we have something else for you. They're going to say, sorry, we don't have anything else for you. You can continue to suffer for the rest of your lives. Sorry that you made the sacrifice you made. That was your choice, right? That does not look good for our community. And it doesn't look good for any of our entire American society. And I think that needs to be considered when the FDA is actually thinking about how they're going to rule on this, and who is actually impacted by a ruling that suppresses a treatment that is this revolutionary for the mental health community from getting access to it. And I think, Edgar, I have a quick question for you, which is, in my experience, and my memory could be mistaken, but I seem to recall that FDA trials that had less data than this for certain indications, like cancer indications or orphan indications, have been stopped prematurely in the past to fast track approval because of the tremendous benefit to public health and to people suffering in those communities. That is true, right?
Priority review. Yeah, you can have priority review, and the Lykos trial, the trials are under priority review also. They will get the expedited review. That's why we're getting the timeline that we're getting. Right.
And so, yeah, so I think that's also important to consider, is, the full picture of what's happening, and really, what message is this sending to our communities? Are our regulatory agencies supporting the health of our communities and our veterans, or do they not really care? And that's something that's going to have to be considered when they're making this, ultimately very political decision.
Lauren?
Yeah, what's alive for me is just resonating greatly with Dave's passion for the dire need our communities find ourselves in, and I've sat on panels with Rick Perry talking about the veteran community, and I'm also very aware of the quiet battlefields in our backyards, and the high price of trauma. And of course the veterans deserve and get a great deal of attention, but so many of the participants who've been through the trials and who are dealing with this kind of angst and PTSD are women who are survivors of sexual abuse. And that number is astronomically high. And I'm always aware of, like, okay, who's perpetrating? What's happening for them? And the system on a whole is just very ill. And I have a prayer that the FDA can demonstrate some wellness and health and perhaps nuance and expedited ways of engaging with this kind of work, where it's radical, it's renegade. We're doing something that's never been done before. And in that we get to applaud and recognize that we're moving forward. We are moving forward. And simultaneously, like, FDA does FDA, and this isn't something FDA has ever done. And it's something that they don't really know exactly how to do, and they don't know what to look for. And my assessment is that a lot of the participants in the committee yesterday, with all of their incredible education, are also new to this conversation and maybe new to this kind of experience. And so they're looking at data that they may not fully understand, and see it as a language that they don't really know, because this is a different kind of treatment. This is a different kind of work. And it is a work that works when it's worked well. And I understand that we had a real problem in our studies, and we've got all kinds of problems, right? Like, the medical and psychotherapeutic field is full of people that are not okay. And, we talk so much about the archetypal wounded healer, right? I'm aware that, like, there's a lot of people that are bleeding on their clients, the wounded. I want more healed healers. You don't have to be perfect, but like there are problems, there are transgressions, there are ethical violations all the time. And that it happened here is a tremendous like problem and grievance. And it shouldn't take away from the rest of the story. And I don't know that the powers that be have the capacity to look with detail at what's going on, and look kind of deeper than even the data, right? Which, by the way, is very robust, like wildly robust. And when we're getting these kinds of stats and facts around treatment, getting FDA breakthrough designation, getting people who continue to improve a year after their treatment, again, like astonishing. Our jaws should be dropped on the floor in awe, because the only problem in my mind is mental health. It's the only one. Every other problem is connected to it, every single one. And when we have interventions that work, like at least let's do some expedited care. I will say yesterday it has me feeling a little lackluster, and I know that I get to vector my attention and my energy towards hope and towards solution. And I believe in this as one. As a very potent one, and I'll keep going, and I know I've got good company with me. So that's my thought on the matter.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Lauren. And we're kind of out of time already, so I'm going to keep it to one more question. A lot of these other psychedelic drug development companies were somewhat using Lykos's trial design as like a template. And they're obviously, a lot of them are using different drugs. Some of them have their own therapy manual, so on and so forth. But in many respects, a lot of them were in some ways mirroring what Lykos was doing on the clinical trial design. What do you think? Like, any advice or thoughts as to what companies like Compass should be doing right now? From what I understand, I don't think Compass has a psilocybin only arm in their trial. So any kind of key takeaways for psychedelic drug development companies based off of this meeting? Edgar, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think it would behoove the industry to come together and have a meaningful conversation with their regulators on the therapy side to help bridge this gap and help FDA understand, not just understand, but complement FDA, because FDA can't, they're not the bad guys. They're not trying to keep these therapies. It's just away from patients. What they're doing is they're doing their job, and they're saying, right now there's this component out here that we don't know, that we don't regulate. So we need to get the regulators of that component together, and it behooves the industry to facilitate that process, to approach their regulators on the therapy side, the psychotherapy side, in order to begin creating a solution to this, what I consider a structural problem. And right now, if Compass and other companies are relying on the approach for therapy that MAPS has generated and shared, I think that's a good thing on the practical side. On the regulatory side, it's obviously deficient right now, and it won't have an approval. So we're not criticizing the therapy, we're criticizing the mechanism that approves these therapies along with a drug, which is a novel question right now. And that's the work that needs to be done.
You're on mute, Justin.
I use Compass as an example. I want to just kind of say I haven't done any sort of diligence on their trial design. Maybe theirs is totally different. So, that good time for disclaimers. No one should take any of this advice as investment advice. There's no attorney-client relationship created by this meeting, and there's no doctor-patient relationship created by this meeting. But good time to drop all those disclaimers out there. And so, Dave, what's your response? Any kind of advice to some of these other psychedelic drug development companies as far as, key takeaways from this meeting?
Yeah, I mean, it is a lot to learn, right? And, I think MAPS, back when it was just MAPS and not Lykos, did, from my understanding, nearly everything they could do to build a tight relationship with the FDA regulators in advance of this situation to prevent this situation from happening. And look where we are, right? We're still here, And so I think that there's an incredible amount to learn. All of these opportunities are really learning opportunities. I think we are learning, number one, that there is a significant education barrier between the folks that make decisions about what we as doctors and what we as patients have access to than what people actually want and what the people are actually doing the work and actually seeing patients firsthand, which I think most of the people who are actually on that committee today don't see patients, or yesterday, right? They don't see patients. So they're academics, so they're people who work in pharma. So, how adequately prepared are they to make judgment? Everybody has an opinion. You put 10 doctors in a room, 10 people are going to give you 10 different opinions. People love to give opinions and they love to argue, right? So I think we have to consider that, and, just remember that there's a big educational barrier between those of us who practice this work actively and those who are actually involved in the trial work and those who are just making decisions from a 10,000 foot view above. But I think that, one thing that is really valuable that we can take away for any companies that are designing drug trials in this space is, don't try to reinvent the wheel per se. Do what big pharma does. Right? Big pharma has a way that's a formula for how they get drugs approved. And that formula has some dramatic expenses to it in certain capacities. In other ways, it is extremely effective. And, they get drugs through like this all the time. Like they're just pumping them out. And they do that because they follow a formula that the FDA is used to. So, I think we as these outside thinkers and these creatives and extremely passionate people, we often think like, let's try to do it our way. And sometimes that's really good. And sometimes it's not so good. And we're in new territory. So we have to do a little bit of both. But, the FDA has a formula. These people are checking boxes on a list, right? That's what they do to approve stuff. And so look at the list. Right? Do whatever we can. If you're designing new drugs, like look at the list, figure out what people have done before, what's worked, what hasn't, and try to figure out, what are the actual criteria upon which we will be evaluated or our drugs will be evaluated so that you have the best chances of getting clearance and approval come the day that you submit, because that will smooth the path for you and for everyone thereafter.
Appreciate that, Lauren.
I like to say I'm tired of diagnosing fish in toxic waters. We don't have a fish problem. We've got a water problem. And part of the water problem is this gap between practice and process and what it means to take something into the zone of approval, right? Like this is a really data-driven process. And there's a real kind of commitment to the numbers and the science of it all. And humans don't conform to this. They don't. And we, like Dave said, let's do what big pharma does. Let's just manipulate our way into what we need to do to get this through, kind of a thing. And it's not the greatest kind of feeling to have, but like there has been a process by which drugs get approved. And for anybody that's wanting to create a study or continue in this one, it's like, how do we model our studies in such a way that we get where we're looking to go, because we know where that is and because we know that it works. And like, this feels like what it means to work within the system for system change, right? Like we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The FDA does FDA, and FDA is like doing what it's doing, and it's not bad, but it's different. And we're doing something different, and how we integrate that into what is, so that people can get the help that they need is a process that we're learning. And again, there were many kind of problems, quote unquote problems, that were identified yesterday in the day-long meeting. Like those problems should be addressed. Those problems need to be considered in how we're creating our studies and formulating the required data set moving forward. But the gap between practice and process is deeply felt by me at this time.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you all giving your feedback. rather than going to questions, because we're over time, I'm looking at most of the questions. I think we've addressed most of them, so I don't think we need to necessarily go through them. But before we close out, if each of you wanted to provide, if you're open to people reaching out and getting in touch with you, provide any contact information or website or anything, I'll start. If anyone's interested in having a conversation about this, email info@eterinvestments.com, ITER investments.com. Edgar, you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm at edgar@kellerasabe.com. That's my law firm. And or else also contact Eater with any questions for me. They'll get to me.
You could get to me through YOU at Embodied Life, INBODIEDLIFE.com. You at Embodied Life.
And you can find me at drdave.io, drdave.io, and you can check out our work on this topic at theboardofmedicine.org.
Thank you all so much, and thank you everyone for attending. I know the vote wasn't what we all hoped for, but I think at the end of the day, things happen for a reason, and hopefully we could get these medicines approved eventually, and hopefully heal a lot of people. So thank you all for attending, and thank you to the panelists for your feedback. Thank you so much. Have a good one.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all.
Thank you.